Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing our discussion of sensation, and we are moving to focus on each of the different senses. So today we're going to talk about vision, which aligns with Learning Objective 1.6b from the College Board. Explain how the structures and functions of the visual sensory system relate to behavior and mental processes. So as part of our discussion about vision, we're going to be focusing on these essential questions. How does the transduction process work in the eye? How do differences in parts of our visual system impact our vision? And what theories explain how we see color? So let's go ahead and get started. As you can remember from our last video, we talked about the idea of transduction, right? And transduction is how our senses translate what's in the environment to something our brain can read. It has 4 basic steps. So 1 and 2, right, or receiving sensory stimulation with specialized cells is represented in 1 and 2. Then those cells transform that into a neural impulse, and then that impulse is delivered to the brain. So today we're going to look specifically at how this works in the eye. All right, so starting with the stimulus that our eye uses, right? So visual stimuli are communicated through light waves, right? And ultimately light waves, like sound waves, have 2 main properties. They have a wavelength and they have an amplitude, right? So if you look at this visual, it demonstrates that the amplitude is the height and the wavelength is the length of the wave. And when we look at color, right, the hue, so the blue, the green, the red, the yellow, that's determined by the wavelength. So a blue is different wavelength than red, is different wavelength than yellow, etc. If we're talking about the amplitude of a light wave, it's going to tell us how kind of bright the color is, so the intensity of it. So if it's like a neon, or if it's really bold, or if it's faded, or if it's pastel, right, that's going to be determined by the amplitude. If you take a look at this visual here, it kind of demonstrates all the different light waves in our kind of visual spectrum. So you see red wavelengths at the top, they have the largest wavelength, and then all the way down to violet, which is the smallest. One way I kind of remember which wavelengths are big and small, which colors are big and small, is I think of red, the Clifford, the big red dog, big wavelength. And then I think of Smurfs, the short little guys, and so blue has a smaller wavelength. I know violet is even smaller, but that's just kind of a way you can remember the large and the small wavelengths. Okay, so we have the light wave, and now it needs to enter the eye. So let's go through a little bit of the anatomy that we need to understand this process. The first is the pupil, right? The light enters the eye, and then the lens takes that light and reflects it onto the retina, right? And the lens has a property called accommodation. So what the lens does is it will actually change its curvature, convex, concave, its thickness, so that it accurately reflects whatever you're looking at onto the retina. However, if we talk about some differences in people's eyes, some people's lens doesn't accommodate correctly, right? The curvature doesn't work exactly right, or the shape of their eye might prevent the curvature, or it might not be as thick or thin as it needs to be. And so this can lead to both being either nearsighted or farsighted, or some combination of those in between, like we have astigmatism. And so if you can see in this graphic, you see we have normal vision where it's reflected directly on the retina. We have nearsighted vision where the image is reflected in front of the retina, and then we have farsighted vision where the image is actually reflected behind the retina. And of course, both nearsighted and farsighted, you would use glasses or contacts to help the accommodation process work correctly. All right, more about the anatomy. So the light has gone into the pupil and it's been reflected from the lens, and now it hits kind of the star of the transduction process, which is the retina. So the retina is a light-sensitive layer at the back of the eye. It has a bunch of receptor cells that do the work of translating the light wave into a neural impulse. We're going to come back to these receptor cells in a minute. However, some other important parts of the anatomy of the eye to know is that there is a spot in the very center of the retina, and it's called the fova, and it is where you have the most visual acuity or clarity. It's why when you want to look at something, you really want to see it, you turn to directly stare at it. You don't look at it from the side, right? You have the most visual clarity in the center of the eye. There is a blind spot in your eye, so where you have no vision because you have no retina, because the optic nerve is leaving the eye in that spot. But you don't notice it because your brain fills it in, and we'll test this in class. And then you have the optic nerve, which you can see, is what's responsible for taking the message from the eye to the brain, most specifically the thalamus and the occipital lobe. All right, so now I'd like to spend some time focusing on the star of the show, the retina, right? And the retina is the star of the show because it does all the hard work of translating those light waves into something that the brain can understand. So the retina has 3 types of cells, but really the rods and cones are what contain the photoreceptors that actually change the light wave into a neural impulse. You have rods that are light sensitive, and you have cones that are color sensitive. And if you take a look, you will see that, you know, in this kind of magnified image of the retina, that there are a lot more rods in the retina than cones, right? So we have a lot more sensitivity to light than we do to color, and they each kind of have their specialized function. Now, once they've changed the light wave into a neural impulse, the rod and the cone then speak to bipolar cells, which then send the message to ganglion cells. The ganglion cells then create the optic nerve, and the optic nerve takes the message up to the brain. So if we take a look at our steps here, we've talked about the light waves, we've talked about the eye, we've talked about the rods and cones that changes it to a neural impulse. Now we just need to focus a little bit on the brain. So we learned this in the bio unit, right? The optic nerve takes the message to the thalamus, that sensory relay station, and the thalamus then sends the message to the occipital lobe. However, we're going to add a little bit of information to our understanding of the occipital lobe. Our occipital lobe has specialized cells called feature detectors. These feature detectors are cells that are meant to look at shapes, angles, movement. They each kind of have a different function. Each cell is specialized, and it activates more with specific parts of the environment. And then what your brain does is it takes the activation from all the individual cells and creates an entire picture that you can then understand. Okay, so moving on to color theory, there are two theories of color that we need to focus on, and the first is this idea of a trichromatic theory. So if you look at this picture of the retina, you will see that there are cones that are in three colors, trichromatic, right? So this first stage of color processing is the idea that your cones contain one of three colors. So it's either a red cone, a green cone, or a blue cone. Now, what happens is that your red, green, and blue cones combined to make, you know, the entire spectrum of colors that you can see. And this is very similar to how a TV works, where they just combine those three wavelengths to create all other wavelengths. We find that this theory of color vision helps explain color blindness, because people who are colorblind are lacking one or two of the color receptors in their cones. So if they're lacking two color receptors, they have what we see, they can only see in black and white. And it's very rare. However, only having one color gone, so seeing in two colors, that's dichromatic. I wouldn't say it's common, but it's more common. They say about 8% of males and about 1% of females, where they have red-green, so either the red or the green is gone, or they have blue, and that kind of alters. So if you take a look here, you'll see this picture in the top left is kind of normal color vision, and then this would be red-green color blindness, this would be blue-yellow color blindness, and then this would be monochromatic, where you only see kind of in shades of gray. Now, the next theory of color vision isn't necessarily against the first theory, but it's like the second step of the process. So what we realized is that color happens in two stages. We have the trichromatic theory that happens first. As you can see in this diagram here, you've got the short, medium, and long wavelengths in the blue, green, and red cones. And then those talk to other retinal cells, namely the bipolar and the ganglion cells, which then process the colors in opposing pairs. The pairs are red-green, blue-yellow, and black-white. When one pair is on, the other is off. So when a cell is, firing for red, it is not firing for green. But then when it's firing for green, it's not for red. However, different cells can fire for red and different cells can fire for green at the same time, which is why you can see red and green next to each other. However, you really don't ever see like a reddish green color in one, or like a bluish yellow color. Like you can see a bluish red color, right? That's like a magenta or purple, but a blue yellow color, like those don't combine. And that's because when one is on, the other is off. So this helps explain another theory or another kind of processing of our color vision, that continues all the way into the brain. So today we've talked about transduction, we talked about differences in our visual system, and we went over the trichromatic and opponent process theories of color. So make sure you can answer these essential questions before you stop the video. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.